Hello and welcome to the fourth Oxplore live stream event. This is a very exciting live stream event today because Oxplore recently turned 1. So I hope you are all, as well as looking forward to our debate, also very excited that, and to celebrate with us that Oxplore is now 1. I am Tom Crawford. I'm a mathematician here at the University of Oxford, and I will be hosting the debate. We have 3 panelists from the university, academics who will introduce themselves shortly. But we've got somebody working in biology, we've got an experimental psychologist, and also somebody working in English. And you may be wondering, this is quite a mix of topics there, and that's because we have a very interesting big question that we're going to be discussing, which is, do we see colour the same? So, having hopefully thought a little bit about the question, and as I said, you'll be hearing from our panel and our thoughts from the academics. We want you guys watching to basically send in your questions and let us know your thoughts throughout this whole event. So you can get in touch on email, you can get in touch on Twitter, Instagram at Let's Oxplore, you can get in touch on the chat window. And if you do send in questions, please do let us know your school. I'll give a shout out to the schools, and then we can put your questions to the panel. But before we introduce the panel, we have a little animation for you just to get you thinking about this big question: do we see colour the same? So hopefully a few things for you to think about and get the gears in your brain starting to get moving. So it's probably time we should meet our panel. So I will allow them to introduce themselves, starting with Sum.
Hi, my name is Sum Segren, and I'm a scientist in the Nuffield Department of Clinical Neuroscience. And my research focuses on light-sensitive cells that lie in a tissue which is at the back of the eye. And the tissue is called the retina, and the light-sensitive cells are called photoreceptors. And there's different types of these photoreceptor cells. So there's cones, which are responsible for our bright light and colour vision. We're going to be talking a lot more about them in a little while. There are rods, which are responsible for our dim light vision. And we've known about these cells for about 200 years, so quite a while. But within the last 20 years or so, we've identified a new photoreceptor cell type, and that's what my research has focused on. And these cells are not involved in your normal visual function, but in what we call non-image forming functions. Things like your internal body clock and setting that to the environmental lighting. So your internal clock drives things like sleep, when you go to sleep at night and when you wake up. But it needs a reference point, so it needs to know what the lighting environment is to be able to set its own rhythm. And it's this new class of photoreceptor cells, which we call melanopsin expressing photoreceptor cells, that drive this light input to the system that sets your internal body clock. And that's what my research has focused on over the last few years.
So anything to do with biology, how our eyes work and how we actually turn those signals into colours and images. Questions for some. Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Smithson. I'm based in experimental psychology here in Oxford. And my research focuses on human colour vision. So I'm particularly interested in the way that the eye and brain process visual signals to give rise to our percepts of colour. In general, the experiments that we do work with adult human volunteers with normal colour vision, and we'll measure very carefully people's ability to discriminate between different colours. If we can tell that somebody can tell the difference between two lights reliably, so above chance, they're not just guessing, then we can also infer that their eye and brain must have processed the difference between those two stimuli. And most of the effort in our experiments goes into carefully defining the stimuli that we're going to use to test people's ability to sense this information. And so by carefully choosing the stimuli, we can infer things that are really very biological in a sense. We can infer some of the properties of the photoreceptor cells that are in the retina. If we use more complex stimuli, we can also infer how people perceive colour and how that depends on the context in which coloured lights are presented. And so we're moving from sensing colour all the way through to interpreting the colour of objects and colours in the context of a more complex visual scene.
Thank you, Hannah. So any questions on how we perceive colour? They will be directed to Hannah. And finally, Nicholas.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Gaskell. I'm in the English faculty at the University of Oxford, and I study the cultural and literary history of color. So because color is involved in so many different corners of culture, this means that I have sort of dipped into a lot of different disciplinary areas. So for instance, I've studied the chemistry of dye production, psychological theories of color perception, but also painting, interior design practices, educational manuals about how and why kids should study color in school, and also novels and poems and advertising strategies. So a whole range of things. And in each case, I look at this material in order to figure out what people at a particular time, specifically 19th and 20th century United States, what they thought color was, what they used it for, what they thought it did to our minds and our bodies, and what it came to mean for them. So that's a lot of my research, and in some ways just understanding the cultural history of color for me is interesting enough, but for me it becomes even more interesting when we think about ideas about color, historical ideas about color, as being a kind of shorthand for bigger ideas about how we relate to the sensory environment more generally. So be that the built environment, how is it that we as embodied people are encountering and manipulating that environment. So that's what I'm up to. So everything from the kind of nitty-gritty of chromatic stuff up to abstract theories of color perception and how they're written about in novels.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's a bit of everything, really, I think it will be fair to say, but sort of history, culture, and interpretation of colour will be questions for Nicholas. So thank you very much, panel. And now that you hopefully have more of an idea of our experts and their fields, hopefully get thinking up some great questions, get sending those questions in. So yeah, chat window, email, or send them in on social media at Let's Oxplore. So we also have a fun challenge for you to have a go at, which will have a prize. And this challenge is to send in the best color name. So this has to be a real color name. We will require perhaps a reference or something to support the color name that you have found, but we want you to send in the best color name that you can find, and then we'll pick our favorite and send you a prize. So just as an example, I really like the name Bubblegum. The fact that it's pink, I don't know why bubblegum and pink go together, but there is a color called bubblegum and it's bright pink, and I really like it. So that's another challenge for you. Right, we better get on to some questions. So Nicholas, I've got a question for you to kick us off. So based on our knowledge of history and literature, do we understand color the same as other people?
Right. So I will defer to my other panelists on the matter of whether we see or perceive colors in the exact same way. But if we're thinking about how we understand colors, then absolutely I think there's variation across cultures, across time periods. And I think we can get at this with a couple of examples. So imagine you're going to a wedding. And what kind of colors do you expect to see? Well, if you're going to a wedding and it's in the UK or the US, you might expect to see the bride wearing white. The groom might be wearing black. Other men in attendance might be wearing dark colors, black, gray, navy blue. So that's the UK or the US. Now imagine you're going to a wedding in China, where the colors white and black are more strongly associated with death and mourning, and that when it's actually considered a kind of affront to show up at a wedding in white or black. So there, the bride might be wearing a red dress, and the men in attendance might be wearing brighter colors. They would avoid dark colors. So in that case, how we understand white might be very different from if we see it in one context where it seems to connote purity, to another context where basically what it means is, it's bringing in ideas of death and things that you don't want at a wedding. So in any case, that's very different. That's thing one. So individual colors have many different meanings and are used in very many different ways according to different cultural practices and as they change in time. Now that's point one. Point two is that what holds for individual colors can also hold for color as a category. So in the time period that I study, in the late 19th century, it's a moment when synthetic dyes suddenly made a range of colors available for lots of different consumer goods in a variety that really wasn't available before. So, for instance, between the 1880s and 1920s, items like cars and steam locomotives and bed sheets and pots and pans and all these different items, clothing, paints, billboards, they all became more colorful, and color was seen in more places by more people. Now, so what this did to the category of color is sort of change it, because before color was associated with royalty, the church, the military. These were all places where you would see the most vivid, best colors. But then suddenly, by 1900, you're seeing these same big, bright colors on circus posters or billboards. And before you know it, color starts to mean, bright colors start to signify low taste or gaudy taste, as opposed to the sort of, halls of power. So there's a case where it's not just an individual color, but color in general that changes its meaning.
Fantastic, thank you, Nicholas. Right, I've got one for you, Sam, which I think follows on really nicely, which is how do we actually see colour? So Nicholas has told us all about how we might understand it differently, but how do we actually see it? And I guess taking it on from that a little bit as well, what kind of things might make us see it differently?
Okay, so I've alluded to this a little bit already in my introduction, but if we think about white light, it's actually composed of all the different colours of light. So if you put light through a prism, it refracts the light and you see a rainbow. Okay, it splits it into its component parts. And if you think about light falling, this white light falling on an object, what happens is, let's say this red balloon, this nice bright red balloon up here, light falls on that object and some of the light is reflected back, and that's the red light, and that's the light that we see, and other lights are absorbed by that object. But it's that reflected light that we detect with those cells in the back of our eye, in that tissue called the retina, and the cells are called cone photoreceptor cells. Now, the simplest thing would be to have one cone for each of the different colours. But if you imagine how many different cones we would have to have, it becomes a little tricky. We actually only have 3 cone types, but these cone cells respond to lots of colours, but they have a preference for a particular colour. So we have red preferring cones, green preferring cones, and blue preferring cones. Our red preferring cones are firing strongly when we look at this red balloon. And although they're responding to this red balloon, they will respond to other colours as well, but to different extents. So if I gave that red preferring cone, if I stimulated it with a darker red stimulus and also stimulated it separately with a bright green stimulus, it might actually respond in the same way. Okay, so it will respond best to this bright red stimulus, but it might respond in the same way to 2 other stimuli. And so how does the system know that there's a difference in the colour that's being seen? Well, what the system does, and this is at the level of the retina and also at the level of the brain, so there's more processing that's done in the visual cortex in the brain. And what happens is it compares the response of the different cone types, of these 3 different cone types, because a green preferring cone will be responding very strongly to that green stimulus, for instance, but it won't be responding very strongly to the dark red or even to this red stimulus. So we look at the comparisons of the different responses from the different cone cells, and that's how we detect colour. And so if I take the second part of your question, but just address it at the level of the retina. So we have 3 different cone cell types, so we're called trichromats, so we have trichromatic vision. If we think about other animals, some of them have more cones, and as you might guess, that might give them a bit of a wider range of colours that they can see. So bumblebees have a UV sensitive cone, and so they can see UV light, which helps them to see nectar, for instance. Some animals have fewer cones, so dogs have 2 cone types, and it's believed that they can mainly see in the kind of yellows and blues and grey region of the spectrum, and not so well in the red region of the spectrum. And this can happen in humans as well. So we can have some humans who can have a loss of one of the cone types, or a mutation in one of the cone types, which makes them see slightly differently. And so we call this, we have red-green colour blindness, for instance, and this actually can affect about 8% of the population, so relatively common. And red-green colourblind people can see more into that kind of blue-yellow region of the spectrum, as I was describing with the dogs. We also have blue-yellow colour blindness, and we can be completely colourblind, not see colours at all. That's quite rare, 1 in about 30,000 individuals. But there are exceptions to this. So there's an island in Micronesia where there's actually 1 in 10 people are colourblind. And apparently this is because there was a tsunami, wiped out the population. There were only a few people left, from which all the descendants arose. And colourblindness was present in that population, that original population, that depleted population, and so that then continued on throughout. So there are some reasons at the level of the retina why you might have differences in colour perception.
Fantastic, thank you. With you mentioning animals, so I know there's an animal called the Mantis Shrimp. If any of you haven't heard of this, you should look them up. They're amazing creatures, and they actually have between 12 to 16 receptors in the eye. So you mentioned humans have 3.
Yes,
dogs
that's
have
right.
2.
Yeah.
And so, of course, we don't really know what these Mantis Shrimp see without asking one, but the fact that they have 12 or 16 would it be fair to say, might suggest they could see perhaps different colours or new colours?
It would suggest that they could. It depends on the ranges of each of those different types. So it might be that they're very overlapping, and then they might not see very different to what we see. So it just depends on the range that each of those cones can see.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, Hannah, feeling a little left out, so we better come to you. Your question is going to be, how do we perceive colour? And I've been informed you have a little visual to help us with this.
So I want to show you a little demonstration. On the screen now, there'll be an image. And while I'm talking, I just want you to look at the little black dot that's in the centre of the image. And this demonstration will work best if you can keep your eyes really still on that black dot. So just stare at that image as I'm talking. So this is quite an unusual thing to ask you to do. You don't often just keep looking in the same place for a long time. And in a minute, you'll see that causes some quite unusual changes in the way you perceive the world. So keep looking at the black dot. But in a minute, I'm going to ask for that to be, for that image to be swapped for another image. So I think you've probably had long enough now. Keep looking, and now the image will be switched. Okay, so if I were to tell you that second image is just a purely black and white image, it's a purely grayscale image, I think many of you may be surprised, because at that instant that the image was switched, you'll have seen full Technicolor in that second image. And so what's going on? Well, I mentioned earlier that one of my research interests is in the way that context or recent history of your perceptual experience, how that changes the way you perceive colour. And in this case, what we've done with the first image is we've chosen the colours in that image very carefully. We've chosen those colours so that they're the complementary colour of the original photograph. So for example, in the original photograph, the sky was blue, as you might expect. And in the original image that you were staring at, that will be the orangish region. And orange is the complementary colour to blue. And what happens when your eyes linger on that dot in the centre of the image for a long time is that the part of your retina that was exposed to, say, the orange light was fatigued. And so the components of your visual system that signal orange were fatigued or adapted. So when you take that stimulus away and replace it by a grey stimulus, what you see is essentially the grey stimulus minus the thing you were looking at before. You've become desensitized to the first image. And so what you see is the opposite of the image that you've been adapting to. And we've chosen the colours carefully so that the opposite image actually gives you a good true-to-life percept of the castle and the sky and the green grass. So we can just flip back again to the original image. Remind yourselves that you've got orange in the top, purpley colours in the bottom, and we flip to the grayscale image again, and that demonstration will be refreshed just for a moment. And there's the original image again, and for that brief moment you'll see the colours again. If you don't believe me that I really am showing you a grayscale image at this point, if you've got a recording of this video, you can always play it backwards and just convince yourself that the second image really is grey, and that the colours you see in it are to do with the way that your eye and brain have processed that information. So I think the thing that I find most interesting about this demonstration is that it reminds us that colour isn't necessarily out there in the external world. It really depends on the way our visual systems sense the incoming light, and our visual systems are continually adjusting their sensitivity so that they're most sensitive to changes. And so when we change that image, we see this illusory colour percept.
Thank you. And this whole video will be on YouTube, so you can actually watch it in reverse, like Hannah suggested, which is perfect. So thank you very much, because I want to do the test myself, so I haven't done it yet, and I'm really intrigued to see if it does work. Right, so we now have a multiple choice question, which is going to be for our panel and also for everyone watching at home and at school. So the question is as follows. 2 linguists gathered colour naming data from 20 languages and found some things that were common across them. For instance, if a language had only 2 terms for colours, what were they? So this is your question. We've got A, blue and red, B, black and white, C, blue and white, and D, black and red. So in other words, you could perhaps think of this as what are the most important colours within a language, what are the first colours that sort of got named. So, panel, do we have any thoughts on this? I think we'll just go in order to keep it easy. So any thoughts on this question? Any way you think of approaching it, of tackling it?
I mean, as a scientist, I'd want to look inside their eyes and figure out what types of cones and rods they have to determine what they would be seeing. Because if they're seeing in black and white, which would be my initial answer, maybe they don't have cones, or maybe they only have one type of cone and so they can't compare colours. But yeah, that's what I'd want to do. But I'm guessing I'm not allowed to do that.
Hannah?
Okay, so I might come at it slightly differently. I might think about the relationship between the way that our visual system works to process information that's out there in the world. And so ultimately we want our visual systems to be able to guide our behaviour. And so we're interested in the visual system processing information that's out there. This question couples something about vision with something about language. And with language, we want language to be useful in communicating the most important things in our environment. And so perhaps I'd come at it in terms of thinking about what's the information conveyed by those different colour pairs that you listed. So how much information is conveyed in a black and white scene? Does black and white TV work? It works pretty well. You can see objects pretty well when you've just got black and white information conveying that. So then I'd make the hypothesis that perhaps this would be an efficient thing to put in language to begin with, that actually conveying differences between light regions and dark regions might be a useful thing.
Nicholas, anything to add?
Yeah, great. I might build on what Hannah was saying and just say that I would also look at what are they doing with color in these different language groups? Is color important for commerce for them, for their artistic practices? And in other words, do they have reasons to generate certain color names rather than others in terms of their day-to-day practices?
Fantastic. So hopefully you've all had a bit of a discussion about this, perhaps hopefully listened to what our panel had to say and sort of given your thoughts and come to an answer, which is in fact B, black and white. So I think most of our panel were I think they knew what was going on, which is good, so because we have sold you as experts, so it's always nice when the panel gets the question correct. So thank you very much. I just have a little bit of information to add. So the actual linguists that carried out this study, for anyone who would like to look into this more, were Brent Berlin and Paul Kay. And what they found was that black and white were the first sort of named colours in a language, and then from there it would then go to red would be third, green and yellow would come next, and they could be in any order. Then it would be blue, and then brown, and then so on. And as I sort of hinted at, this was their hypothesis was that these were the most important or the most memorable or noticeable colours in the environment. Though I believe, Nicholas, you have something to also add.
Right.
To
well,
this.
just to say that after they published their research, a lot of people objected, and especially there were anthropologists who thought that maybe the study was a little too Western-centric in terms of how it was framing the question. So even just assuming that color categories are somehow primary and the most important in terms of how language carves up visual experience. So maybe some languages actually care more about luminescence or brightness or texture than they do hue. And in this regard, it's not so much black and white, it's light and dark. And so one question that people posed is, are black and white the same as light and dark? Are light and dark color terms? And maybe Berlin and Kay were kind of shoehorning some words into a concept that they already had in their minds.
So again, as always with Oxplore, big questions, a lot to think about. Not quite as simple or as black and white as it may seem. That was even planned, that just happened. Right, okay, I've got a question here for you, Sum, which has come in from Marco. So hi Marco, at Park Lane International School in Prague, which is, do colourblind people grow up thinking one colour is another, and how can it be treated, if indeed it can?
So I was sitting next to someone who was colourblind the other day at lunch, actually, and I asked him, so how has this affected you? He couldn't really give me an answer because he'd adapted to the fact that he was colourblind. So he would take different cues for things. And so it didn't really affect him in any way, apart from when he put up graphs. So he's a scientist, and when he gave talks and he put up graphs and someone would say, and the orange bar, what does that say? And he would be thinking, there's no orange bar there. So, in some contexts it did affect him, but in others he'd adapted to this. Mm-hmm. And the second part of the question was
about treatment.
Treatment.
Can we treat colour blindness, or is there a way to?
At the moment, no, we can't. So potentially, I guess you could replace the gene, or you could change the mutation that's causing the effect. But it's not something that is available at the moment, no.
Okay, future, for anyone watching, there's a future research question for you all to hopefully, have a go at, perhaps, in the future. Thank you. Right, so Hannah, I've got an interesting question for you here. So this has come in from Maisha, I hope I'm saying that correct, at Cheadle Hume School. And this is, when somebody goes blind as a teen or adult, do they begin to perceive colour differently?
So I think it would depend on what's causing their blindness. This is also something that some will know a lot about and has worked on related questions. So some causes of blindness will preferentially affect some of the cones before they affect, for example, the rods. So if in the progression of the disease you find that the cones are selectively damaged, and particularly if one type of cone is damaged before the other type of cones, then there'll be a change in the way in which you sense light of different wavelengths, and that will have an impact on your colour perception. One thing that is quite strong in terms of our colour perception is that we don't notice very gradual changes. So one thing that happens as we age, as everybody ages, the lens that's in the front of your eye becomes yellower and yellower. And by the time you're in your 90s, it can be really quite dark yellow, almost brown. And that's acting as a filter across everything that you see. So it's like looking at the world through this yellowish filter. But as we grow and age, we don't notice that that changes. And so we're slowly readjusting and adapting to these changes in our visual systems as we age. In cataract surgery, the lens is taken out and is replaced by a clear lens. So the days after cataract surgery, people often report that the world looked so blue, the colours were so vibrant, and so that moment of change is particularly when you notice differences.
Thank you very much. Right, and one for you, Nicholas. Did people in the past have different names for colours?
Yes. So I can only really speak to English, but basically just the linguistic palette has just grown, and it grows with need. So you can think about, I mean, you mentioned industry earlier, I think, in terms of its effect on color vocabulary. But basically, it's not so much that red ceased to be red. Red has been red for a very, very, very long time. But cherry red or fire engine red or whatever, those are relatively new. So part of the question is, one of the things you might think about is like, where did certain color names come from? So such that instead of just a basic category of red, we get lots of different reds. And sometimes they come from object names. So the most obvious ones in English are orange and violet. We've sort of adopted those as color terms, but they started as objects, and then somebody said, hey, we can use this as a color term. And then, apricot, same thing. But when you get a little into the consumer era, when we've got thousands of colors and we need thousands of names, it gets so abstract that it's hard to pin to an object. Like, I'm sure if you go, shopping for makeup or something, you can see like envy or, mist, something like that, that it's hard to actually pin to a real world object.
So there's a few colour name examples. I hope you've all been sending them in as part of our challenge. Nicholas has given you a few there. Right, great, thank you. Okay, so I would now like to discuss the dress. So you all knew this was coming. Perhaps those watching may have thought we might touch on this. So in case you aren't aware, this was an internet meme, and this was a picture of a dress, and some people saw it one colour and other people saw it a different colour, and this created all kinds of debate and very heated arguments, in fact, online. So we do have the image for you, which I believe we're going to show on the screen. So guys, do you remember which colour you saw when you look at this image?
Yeah, well, I still see white and gold.
I still see
yeah,
blue and black.
All right, so we've already got disagreement, Nicholas.
White and gold all the way.
Okay, so I think so. As a panel, we're going to go democratically and say that it's white and gold. We had 2-1, but okay. Of course, what is going on here, really, right? What is happening that some people do see this image in different colours. So I think, Hannah, this seems like it'd be something right up your street.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, I'm interested in the way context changes the way we perceive colours and how colours appear to us. In this image, it's a photograph of a dress. It's not a very good photograph, but it's a photograph of a dress. Some regions of the photograph are slightly overexposed, so you don't see much detail in the background, for example. But what's happening is that the camera's capturing the light that's reflected from the dress. The dress itself isn't emitting light. The only way that we see it is because it's reflecting the light that shines on it, and it's reflecting that light back to the camera. And so when we look at that photograph, we've got to make a judgment. Our visual systems are used to perceiving objects, and we've got to decide in the photograph what aspects of the photograph are due to the illumination and what aspects of the photograph are due to the fabric of the dress itself. And so probably the strongest consensus on giving an explanation for this difference between the population is that people are making different inferences about the lighting that's falling on this dress. And so if you perceive the dress as though it's in shadow, you'd be more likely to perceive the dress as white and gold. If you perceive it as though it's directly illuminated, you'd be more likely to see it as blue and black. And so that's about how you parse that image, how you make sense of that photograph that's been presented to you. Some people find that the percept is very robust, that whenever you see it, you'll always see it as white and gold, for example. Other people find that if you change the context a little bit, you can influence your perception. So, for example, if you print out a version of this photograph, cut out the dress, and then put it in different contexts, you might be able to change the way you perceive those colours. And so that might give you a little bit of an insight into how the other group of people are seeing this thing.
It sounds quite similar to your example you gave us at the beginning, when you were saying you're sort of creating a particular, you're making the sort of the environment so that people see a particular thing.
Yeah.
In some sense.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. So I think that is pretty much all we're going to have time for in terms of audience questions. So sorry for everyone we haven't got to your question, but again, thank you for sending them in, and do keep sending them in. We will keep the prize draw open until 11 o'clock tomorrow. So do keep sending in your questions, and we will pick our favourites and send you prizes. Right. So we're going to sort of have to come to the final vote now. So there will be a link at the bottom of the screen which you can go to vote, and this will be on our question. So do we see colour the same? And there are 4 options ranging from yes, no, and maybe. There are 2 different options in no, just with more of an explanation there. So panel, you're going to also have to answer this question with the options of yes, no, maybe. So we'll start, I think, with you, Sum, as we have been. Okay. So do we see colour the same?
I don't think we do, especially if we consider the issues with red-green colour blindness. But I think it's just not as simple as one person sees it this way, another person sees it another way. People adapt to having a lack of a certain cone, or it's not common that you actually have the cone missing. You actually have a problem with that cone, a mutation in that cone, and you just see things slightly differently to someone else. And you can adapt for these things. And it's only in certain circumstances that it might come out that actually you're seeing things slightly differently to other people. But if you think about the perception, which Hannah's been talking about, it's not just at the level of the eye, it's also at the level of the processing of that information, at the level of further back into the retinal processing, but also in the brain. Maybe Hannah would like to follow up there.
So I think it is very difficult to ask about people's experiences of colour. But we can certainly sort of constrain the question a little bit and say, do we sense colour in the same way? And we know an awful lot about the underlying biology and the machinery in our eyes that allow us to sense light of different wavelengths. But we can also say that there are some general principles. So even if we don't necessarily say we have the same experience elicited by a red fire extinguisher, for example, but we can generally, often as a population, agree on certain things. So for example, if I said to you, which pairs of colours are closer together, I think you'd probably agree that red and orange are closer together than red and green, for example. There's more similarity between red and orange. So there are these structural properties of the way we experience colour that are quite well preserved across different people. And things like the colour after images, for example, that will work in a very high proportion of the population. And so there are uniformities in the way that our brains process colour information that are preserved across people that I think constrain our colour experience.
Fantastic.
Right, and I would agree with all of that, and also just say that it depends on what we mean by see. So if we mean sense, perceive, or understand. So in the case of history and literature, there are certainly instances of people understanding colors very differently. But I also agree that I think we know enough to say that we generally do sense, we can make good generalizations about the colors of the world, so that a lot of the philosophical speculation about if my red is your blue sometimes is a little off the track.
Fantastic. Right, so I'm getting a general no, would be the panel's
right.
opinion? Okay, just have to try and get some kind of democratic consensus. All right, so you've heard from the panel, you've heard from, hopefully you've been discussing this amongst yourselves in your schools or with your friends and whatnot. So remember, do vote and do keep sending in your questions, all the way open for the prize draw until 11 a.m. tomorrow. And then the results of the vote will be on social media tomorrow afternoon. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much to our panel for joining us. Thank you to everybody watching at home and at school for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you are interested in more of what Oxplore has to offer, please do visit oxplore.org or check out Let's Oxplore on various social medias. We have lots of very fun things. And yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time.